projects all over the world. Highlight a few projects that inspire you as a designer and offer solid investment returns, in particular in these markets.
Well, I think we have several projects that are ongoing now. One is in Brazil, in the northeast of Brazil. It's actually an extension of a metropolitan area. It acts very much as a resort, but it is part of the fabric of a larger community, and we think that's the best way to find sound value in resort-oriented product today. Not looking at it only as a destination resort, but as something that services the local market, and in that case the Brazilian national market, which we see a lot of internal growth. Another project is in the center of Europe, in Slovakia. It's a spa project, which is actually very ecologically oriented. It's something that's carbon neutral. It derives all its energy through geothermal sources. And that project is on about 300 hectares. It includes spas, aqua parks, golf, other sporting activities, equestrian, etc. And this is actually even accessible by rail. It's on one of the main railway lines that runs from Vienna, Bratislava to the east of the country. Very accessible to enormous catchment area in the heart of Europe, near 3 capital cities, within an hour and 20 minutes of 3 airports. And it really provides a unique experience because the water qualities are very similar to that of the Dead Sea. It's actually 22 million year old water that comes to the surface at 82, 83 degrees centigrade. And of course we have to cool it down and this kind of thing. And it's during that cooling process we derive the energy. But also, it has medicinal qualities that have been proven. There's a long tradition in Central Europe of these places in Hungary and Austria and Czech Republic and in Slovakia. And this will really be a cutting-edge facility, attracting more of the younger generation that in the past has been a bit less interested in this kind of product. Already there are, of course, many more elderly people, retired people benefit from these spas in this part of the world. But here we're looking at something that's a lot younger, a lot more energy, and again in the heart of Europe. Good investment too, because Slovakia is already in the Eurozone, so a very stable investment location at this time.
Designing for the future, how do you balance the commercial needs with the eco-friendly green developments?
Well, I basically believe that the sustainability angle is just simply the core to design today. You cannot begin a design without thinking about the sustainability issues. As I mentioned, the projects that we're looking at now, just in terms of their location, they're strategically located so that the act of getting there is simplified, reduces your actual energy consumption, etc., whether it's giving you options to get there or whether it's that you're actually building as part of a community that already exists. Other issues have to do with minimizing energy consumption. We try to, when in climates like in Brazil, we integrate solar technologies. We design the buildings so that we take advantage of prevailing breezes, so that often buildings that would be air conditioned in that city, we would actually design in such a way where we don't even need that air conditioning. People can have it, of course, but we really do everything possible so that it's not needed. And that's often going back to traditional building techniques in some way, basically learning from what's been done for hundreds of years. But of course we deal with that in an aesthetic which is a very contemporary aesthetic and a very airy and open aesthetic which may be different from some of the traditional building types. When it comes to our projects in Europe, we're often seeking other energy sources. I mentioned the geothermal before. This is a great opportunity in parts of Central Europe. We're often looking also at wind technologies now to integrate the use of wind towers into the urban design of a project, so that what might have been the church steeple in the past, perhaps today is the wind tower that begins to be the symbol of a particular district. So we're looking at sustainability as really a foundation for the way we design our buildings today. And as long as you build that into your process very early, it's not a hindrance at all. It's actually a motivator to create much more exciting buildings.
Over the last 10 years, we've seen an explosion for icon building designs, like the Burj Al Arab Hotel in Dubai, now its 10th anniversary and recognized all over the world, making a statement. What will be the new elements inspiring designers, developers, governments for the next decade in building designs?
Okay. Well, first of all, I think that the hotel in Dubai was marked really the beginning of a great era for Dubai, and I can't imagine Dubai today without it. So it's a wonderful symbol, and it worked extremely well in that respect. I would say, though, that the biggest issue now in the next decade is not going to be so much creating these monuments. It's going to be re-knitting communities. Is one of the keys to not only sustainability, but also to the marketability of a place, is that you go beyond the icons, but you deliver a total experience. So that total experience is sometimes harder to achieve than the individual points. And I'll give an example of one of our very large projects in Poland, the largest project in Central Europe, was done without any big-name architects. It was done with a number of local architects. We maintained a high level of quality throughout the whole project, and the focus was building a neighborhood. And we truly believe that it's by building neighborhoods, it's by building the quality of a region that you really create value. And you create long-term value, and I think that's what we have to be looking for now. So I think we'll see fewer iconic structures, but we're going to see better communities being developed and re-knitting communities that perhaps today are still a bit haphazard.
Do you consider any parts of the world to be less affected by the downturn in these financial markets affecting real estate developments?
Well, I would have to say that we're seeing that Latin America seems to be a bit less affected. It's not to say that it's not affected, but I think it's less affected. We look at countries like Brazil. We found Brazil very interesting even a few years ago because of its autonomy vis-a-vis energy. They became autonomous as of last year because they're growing a lot of their fuels and they have their own oil supplies and actually reserves that are quite substantial. So what we find is that that's a very interesting market because it is somewhat independent of energy cost fluctuations. It's also the world's largest food producer, so even during rough times, people are still eating. So they still have a very strong export base, and of course they've progressed enormously in terms of technology and aircraft, these kinds of businesses. Although even if those suffer, we have strengths in other sectors. And I think that Brazil seems to be less affected today. Another key aspect to Brazil is that they have very little exposure to this credit crisis and the mortgage crisis because mortgages as a percentage of GDP are minimal, much less than 5%. The figure is probably closer to 2 or 3%. And of course that same figure in the US is probably over 100%. So I think that in itself says a lot about why that's a more stable market at this time. Where would you start development now? I mean, I would still go, just in principle, I would go for brownfield sites in excellent locations that are underdeveloped. I mean, I think in today's world, you always look for a brownfield site or a previously developed site rather than going for a greenfield site. That's just my opinion. And if you do go to a greenfield site, you need to have very good reasons for developing that as opposed to developing within the fabric of the city. So I think what I'll answer is basically you should be looking for ideal or very strong sites within the existing fabric of communities as opposed to looking for new greenfield development. You know, I think that's the message at this time. I basically think that in today's market there are opportunities to pick up parcels that where developments may not have gone through, that are in very good locations, but that they are basically part of an existing fabric. So you should first look for those good sites within already established areas, but also if you're looking at larger sites, think of those sites as being part of a fabric, but being able to upgrade the value of that whole area, because I really believe that it is districts that create value, not individual buildings. So either buy into a district on a site that you can develop at this time that's already a prime district, or look for districts where you can actually have a positive impact on the whole area, and you will have a valuation multiple because of the enhanced quality of that whole district through your project. I think that it's preferable than developing greenfield at this time. There are all kinds of sustainability issues, but you also have infrastructure that's usually in place. You have the possibility of creating much more walkable environments, which I think is going to be one of the keys to value over the next decade. That we're not going to be looking at isolated developments in the same way. We're going to be looking at what is part of an established community, or how do you enhance a community or part of a district. What's also very important to keep in mind is what you do on those sites. Look at creating a complementarity to what exists. Don't look at doing more of what already has been done well, but rather look at what's missing. because that's what's going to add value to the neighborhood, and it's also what's needed by the neighborhood. So for example, if it's a predominantly residential neighborhood, well, consider retail development as a component that would be walk-in retail. Consider an office component, because more and more people are not willing to waste time driving around to go to an office. They want to have that to be very convenient. We're actually seeing more and more people wanting to go back home for lunch now, as opposed to this kind of system where the last 100 years we spent our lives going farther and farther from our home to our place of work. That is now being compressed. So as you look for sites in these more urbanized areas or in these districts, think of how your program can complement that district. We're going to live differently.
Yes, certainly.
And this is the time to actually make that shift.
Yeah.
We shouldn't be thinking of the formulas we were using over the last decades, because we actually have to question those formulas.
Yes.
And see how this has gotten us into a lifestyle that is not only unsustainable environmentally, but apparently it's also unsustainable economically.
Yes.
So we need to rethink those things. We're seeing that this global crisis is working in two ways. I think it is helping people be more efficient, to rethink what they've been doing. But in some cases, it has led to the compromise of projects. Certain projects, for example, we had slated to develop with solar technologies. Those have basically been shelved because they say, well, there's an additional cost to putting that in, and right now everyone's just worried about getting a loan to be able to buy an apartment. So they're not so worried about the long-term costs. I don't necessarily agree with that, but this is a reality, even among the best developers in the market. So I think this is an issue that's an important one. We should not forget the longer-term sustainability issues, and that's seeping through the cracks right now because perhaps we're in a period that would be maybe considered near panic, where people are just trying to get product out at a lower price. But I really think we have to look at the life cycle of a building. We have to make sure that we're creating things that are efficient in the long term and make economic sense in the long term, and not just for the initial sales. We should be thinking of that secondary market, but it's very difficult to think of it sometimes during a period of difficulty like today's. We're beginning to have this rating system all over Europe, and a lot of developers are a bit afraid of this rating system because they're suddenly going to see, oh, their building is a D building or an F building, whereas they're supposed to be a blue chip developer. And I think it's like when you're buying a refrigerator. You see right away, A, B, C, D, E, F. You're going to have the same option now in places like Poland to know, what am I buying into? And I think it's a great thing, but I'll tell you, there are a lot of developers that are very nervous about this because they're saying, oh, well, we used to just be able to sell something based on image and location, but now it's got to be efficient as well. And the project potentially could be priced down because of its inefficiency. Again, we haven't seen, this law has not come into effect yet, but it certainly will soon, and I'm actually very hopeful that it will change a bit the way developers are thinking about their buildings, and also change the way purchasers are thinking about their properties.
Yeah, because it has to be addressed for the future.
Yeah, and the time is now.
Yes.
I mean,
they have to do it now because it'll be low.
Exactly. It has to be now, and it's already a problem that we have so much fabric that is quite inefficient. So much of our buildings. I'm very concerned for countries like the United States, which have a majority of population living on the edges of cities now. Cities like Atlanta are 200 kilometers across. Everyone's living in a little house, and all of those houses, even if they're well insulated, are not very efficient, not nearly as efficient as living in London or Paris or Amsterdam, in cities that are more dense. Not to mention the energy consumed just to get from one point to another. A typical resident in Atlanta drives about 60 kilometers a day to exist, and that includes people without driver's licenses. Okay, now that's great for oil companies. It's great for the automobile manufacturers, but it's really not a good thing for the planet, and it's actually not a good thing for people's health either. So when we begin to look at these issues together, we realize that we have to rethink the fabrics that we're developing, and that's why I suggested earlier that look at infilling the fabric, tying the fabric together again, because that's the way we have to live as a civilization. We don't have the options that we had 20 or 30 years ago. We just don't have them. In my lifetime, I have commuted by car to work 3 months. The rest of the time I've either walked or taken a subway, and I'm absolutely happy about that. I love cars. I have some nice cars. But I use them for pleasure. I don't let them use me.
Yeah.
So once you're creating an urban environment where you're dependent on the automobile, well, you're basically thinking in the 20th century. You're not thinking this century. That is a technology and a way of life that is characterized, I would say, much more by the 20th century.
Yeah. Yeah.
I was asked by Jerry Hines back in the 80s to do a theoretical master plan for downtown Houston, okay? It was an absolutely silly idea, I suppose, but he wanted me to do this through an organization called Central Houston. And I projected a master plan that had no new office buildings, no new towers. I had lofts, which were either apartments or small offices and things like that. And I just said, stop building towers, just infill the rest of downtown, get rid of these parking lots. And of course, he paid me and thanked me very much, but said, this is Houston, you know, this will never happen. And 10 years later, you could see full-page articles in the New York Times talking about the boom of loft-style development in downtown Houston, that all these people who grew up in the suburbs were fed up and they were coming downtown, and so they were making Soho artificially, actually, and is exactly what I was proposing. But I could make that kind of wacky projection as a student. By the time you get to be a professional, you can't really do that. So I would, you know, what I would say, and I'm not sure what the question is really, but the issue is, let your intuition help you define what you're trying to you know, what intuitively you think needs to be done. You grow up in an environment, and naturally you're going to react to that environment. In the case of many young Americans, in the case of Houston, for example, many people reacted to this suburban environment that they grew up in, which is very strange by international standards, because you have lots of single-family houses, enormous wealth, big surfaces, many cars, all this kind of thing. You go to the shopping malls all have the same shops here and there. You have the fast food restaurants, they're also the same everywhere. And you had a whole generation in America that we're now seeing coming to power in some cases, but also they're making decisions about where they want to live, and they're choosing a much more urban lifestyle. So in the case of Houston, when I did this analysis for Jerry Hines as a graduate student, you know, they were a bit shocked by the outcome, but it ended up being exactly what happened 10 or 15 years later. And one of the fastest growing residential markets in the U.S. was the downtown housing market in Houston. When I started this analysis, there were about 100 residents in all of downtown Houston, and many of them were homeless, so it was hard to tell how many were actually living there. But it became a very fashionable place to live, and many people decided to start walking to work, and this was an unusual thing in a city that was basically based on the premise of consuming as much oil as possible. So what we see is that people do evolve, and that young people sometimes have an intuition which is the right one. And we engage students at MIT, we've done it in the past with Harvard, the University of Toronto, where we involve them in our projects, especially when we have projects with a long lead time, where we work with the students to probe their own ideas so that they open the minds up of the developers, of the politicians, et cetera, about what the opportunities are on a given site in their environment. And we've done this in Sao Paulo, we've done this in Kiev, we've done this in Bratislava. And each time we attract students to the class from all over the world, and they really come with different ideas. And there have been some inspirational ideas. There was an idea in Sao Paulo to create an eco-garment district. There was a struggling garment district near the heart of Sao Paulo. And one of the ideas was, well, let's redefine this garment district so it's not competing with China anymore. Let's make it an ecological garment district. So it doesn't even compete anymore with Paris or Milan or any of these other cities, because it's really, Brazil is a legitimate place to actually develop that theme. And it's a theme that's a growing theme in all sectors of our society. And this was something that came out of the students who just said, look, well, we shouldn't change this garment district. We shouldn't try to gentrify it and all of this. Let's just make it an appropriate garment district for the market today and for the global market today, and something that will actually enhance the image of Sao Paulo at the same time. So these are the kind of things that I think students are very comfortable with expressing, but they're often professionals, because we're so tied to the principles that we've been developing and to the financing systems and to the existing political orders, that we're often not as open as we need to be in today's times. Young designers should try to have a broad-based education so that they can understand how their design fits into the larger puzzle. Because if they don't, they won't be able to make a decision like these students who said, let's do an eco-garment district. That meant they had to understand something about logistics, they had to understand something about economics, they had to understand something about marketing, and they also had to understand something about sociology, that you're not trying to turn over the city, but rather let it evolve. And I think that often you have very, very strong designers, and many of the signature designers that were popular over the last 10 years are very focused on design. But design is a small part of the equation, and we are designing for people, we are designing for economies, and we are designing for this planet, and those issues all have to come together. So my encouragement is, of course, develop your design skills, but really you need to be a sponge during your earlier years so that these other sensibilities become intuitive, that they're not something that you have to really worry about, they're something that are just there as part of your designer palette.